The crazy mountains of Montana do not forgive. They rise up from the yellow plains, like a jagged piece of bone breaking through the skin of the earth. People call them the Crazies for a reason. It is not just the wind that howls through the canyons, or the way the peaks hide behind a veil of gray clouds for weeks on end. There is a weight there. A pressure that sits on your chest when you step off the trail and into the deep timber. Most hunters who go up there come back with stories of elk and cold nights. But some do not come back at all. And when they do, they are not the same people who walked in. This is the story of Aaron Hedges. A man who knew the woods. A man who had the right gear. A man who simply came apart in a place that defies every law of logic we hold dear. Aaron Hedges was 38 years old in the autumn of 2014. He was not a weekend warrior or a city man playing at being a mountain goat. He was a seasoned hunter. He was fit. He was prepared. On September 7th, he set out with two friends for a week-long hunt in the high country. They were targeting elk in the backcountry of the Gallatin National Forest. The plan was simple. They would hike in, set up camp, and find their prize. But the mountains have a way of changing plans. Aaron was carrying a heavy pack. He had his bow. He had his radio. He had enough supplies to last. But as they climbed higher into the thin air, something began to shift. The air grew colder. The silence grew thicker. And Aaron started to fall behind. It was on the trail towards Sunlight Lake that the group decided to split. Aaron told his friends he was going to take a different route. He wanted to head toward a specific cache of supplies they had dropped earlier. He was struggling with the weight of his pack and the steepness of the grade. His friends watched him walk away, thinking they would see him at the campfire later that evening. That was the last time any human soul saw Aaron Hedges alive. He walked into the tree line and the forest simply swallowed him. No shout. No radio call. No struggle. Just the sound of boots on dry pine needles and then nothing. The sun went down. The temperature plummeted. And the silence of the Crazies took hold. When Aaron did not show up at the camp, his friends did not panic immediately. They knew he was experienced. They thought he might have hunkered down for the night. But by the next morning, the air had turned bitter. A storm was rolling in. Montana weather in September is a fickle beast. It can be 70 degrees at noon and 10 degrees by midnight. Snow began to fall. Not a light dusting, but a heavy, wet blanket that covered the tracks and muffled the world. The search began in earnest on September 10th. Search and rescue teams, helicopters with thermal imaging, dogs trained to find a scent in the deepest brush. They swarmed the area around Sunlight Lake. They looked in every crevice. They called his name until their throats were raw. But the mountain did not answer. The searchers were looking for a man. But what they found was a riddle, miles away from where Aaron was last seen. In a direction that made no sense for his destination. They found his boots. They were sitting near a creek, side by side, as if he had simply stepped out of them and walked away. This is where the narrative starts to fracture. Why would an experienced hunter remove his boots in sub-zero temperatures? Why would he leave the very things that protected him from the jagged rocks and the freezing mud? The dogs could not pick up a scent from the boots. It was as if he had evaporated into the gray sky. The thermal cameras on the helicopters saw nothing but the cold, dead slopes of the range. The search was eventually called off as the winter snows buried the peaks in 10 feet of white powder. A year passed. The snow melted. The flowers bloomed. And then, another piece of the puzzle surfaced. In June of 2015, a search party found Aaron's backpack and his bow. They were located miles from the boots, across a ridgeline that would be difficult for a man in peak condition to traverse, let alone a man without boots. The gear was not scattered. It was not torn by animals. It was just sitting there, waiting. Inside the pack were his electronics, his radio, his extra clothes. Everything he needed to survive was right there. And he had abandoned it. The investigators looked at the terrain and shook their heads. To get from the last known point to the boots, and then to the backpack, Aaron would have had to move like a ghost through some of the most vertical, punishing landscape in the lower 48 states. But the final act of this tragedy was the most disturbing of all. In August of 2016, nearly 2 years after Aaron disappeared. His remains were found. They were not on the mountain. They were not in the deep woods. They were found on a private ranch on the other side of the range. The distance from where he was last seen to where his bones were found was nearly 15 miles as the crow flies. But Aaron Hedges was not a crow. To get to that spot, he would have had to climb over a 9,000-foot peak and descend through miles of tangled deadfall and rock slides. He was found less than half a mile from a ranch house with a porch light that stayed on all night. He was found in an area that had been searched by air and on foot multiple times during the initial disappearance. The condition of the remains offered no answers. His clothes were shredded, but not in a way that suggested a mountain lion or a bear. It was as if they had simply disintegrated over time. His skull was there, staring up at the Montana sky. The official cause of death was listed as exposure. Hypothermia. They say that when the body freezes, the brain can misfire. It is called paradoxical undressing. The victim feels a sudden, intense heat and begins to strip off their clothes to cool down. It is a desperate, final act of a dying mind. But paradoxical undressing does not explain how a man walks 15 miles over a mountain range without boots. It does not explain how he avoids every search party, every helicopter, and every thermal camera for days on end. It does not explain the silence. There are things in the crazy mountains that the maps do not show. The Crow people who lived in this valley for centuries called these mountains the Awaxawipia. They believed the peaks were inhabited by little people and spirits that could lead a man astray. They believed the mountains could move, that the geography itself was alive and hungry. When you look at the map of Aaron's final journey, it looks like the path of someone who was being chased, or someone who was being led. He moved in a zigzag pattern, defying the natural contours of the land. He ignored the easy paths. He ignored the water sources. He climbed higher and higher until he reached the limit of human endurance. And then he kept going. Think about the physical reality of that journey. Imagine walking on jagged limestone and frozen mud with no shoes. Every step would be agony. Every inch of skin would be sliced and bruised. And yet, there was no trail of blood. There were no signs of a struggle. It is as if Aaron Hedges was plucked from one side of the mountain and dropped on the other. Or perhaps, the mountain opened up and let him walk through the middle of it. We like to think we understand the wilderness. We think that with our GPS units and our high-tech Gore-Tex jackets, we are safe. But the wilderness is not a park. It is a void. And sometimes, the void looks back at you. It waits for you to be tired. It waits for you to be alone. And then, it whispers. The case of Aaron Hedges is not an isolated incident. It fits a pattern that we see over and over again in the national parks and forests of North America. A person goes missing. The weather turns bad immediately. The dogs cannot find a scent. The gear is found in a location that suggests the victim was acting in a way that defies survival instincts. And finally, the body is found in a place that has already been searched, or in a location that is physically impossible to reach. It is a sequence of events that repeats with a terrifying frequency. We call it a mystery because we are afraid to call it what it really is. A harvest. Take the case of Keith Parkins, a 2-year-old boy who vanished from his grandfather's ranch in Nevada in 1943. He was found 19 hours later, 12 miles away. After crossing 2 mountain ranges and multiple fences, he was alive. But he could not explain how he had traveled such a distance in such a short time, or consider the disappearance of Jared Atadero in the Rocky Mountain National Park. His remains were found years later on a cliffside that was nearly impossible to scale, far above the trail where he was last seen. These are not accidents. These are anomalies. They are glitches in the world we think we know. Aaron Hedges did not just die of the cold. He was taken by something that we do not have a name for yet. Something that lives in the high places, where the air is thin and the light plays tricks on the eyes. The crazy mountains still stand there, watching the plains. They are still jagged. They are still cold. And they are still waiting for the next hunter to fall behind the group, the next hiker to take a wrong turn, the next soul to wander into the deep timber and forget why they were there in the first place. If you go into the Crazies, keep your boots on. Keep your friends close. And whatever you do, do not listen to the wind when it calls your name. Because the mountain is always hungry, and it has all the time in the world. The search for Aaron Hedges did not end with the discovery of a few items of clothing. It only deepened into a wound that the mountain refused to let heal. You have to understand the geography of the failure. The sheer arrogance of the topographical maps that claim to know the Crazies. When the search teams moved into the higher elevations, they were stepping into a different dimension of reality where the air tastes like wet copper and the silence has a physical weight. One searcher described the feeling as being at the bottom of a deep, dark well while the sun was still shining overhead. They found his first boot at an elevation of nearly 9,000 feet. Perched on a rocky outcrop, like it had been placed there by a window dresser in a high-end department store. There was no scuffing on the leather. No signs of a frantic struggle against the scree. Just a single lone boot, waiting for a foot that would never return. It sat there while the wind howled through the jagged peaks. A piece of expensive leather and Gore-Tex that had failed its primary mission. The second boot was found miles away, on the opposite side of a ridge that should have been impassable for a man in socks. Think about that for a second. Really, let the physics of it sink into your marrow. To get from the first boot to the second, Aaron would have had to traverse miles of sharp volcanic rock and tangled deadfall in his stocking feet. The searchers looked at their own heavy-duty climbing boots and wondered how a human being could endure that kind of pain without screaming loud enough to be heard in the valley below. But there were no reports of screams. No sightings of a limping hunter. Only the tracks that ended abruptly, as if he had simply stepped off the face of the earth. The dogs. Those highly trained bloodhounds that can find a drop of sweat in a hurricane. They just sat down and whined. They refused to cross the invisible line where the scent ended, tucking their tails and looking at their handlers with eyes full of a primal, ancient terror. Terror. The investigative files are thick with depositions from men who have spent 30 years in the backcountry. Men who do not scare easily. They talk about the way the light changed during the search. How the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the trees and move independently across the snow. One veteran ranger mentioned a hum, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the fillings in his teeth and made his nose bleed for no reason at all. We are told these are symptoms of high-altitude sickness or simple exhaustion. But these men were acclimatized. They knew the thin air. They knew the limits of their bodies. They were experiencing something that the National Park Service does not have a checkbox for on their incident report forms. They were experiencing the presence of the mountain. A sentient, hungry intelligence that views us as nothing more than temporary intruders. When Aaron Hedges was finally found, more than a year after he vanished, he was in a place that defied all logic. His remains were discovered by a rancher on the northern edge of the range, miles from where any reasonable person thought he could have traveled. He was lying in a small clearing, his gear scattered around him in a way that suggested a bizarre ritual rather than a desperate attempt at survival. His backpack was there. His bow was leaning against a tree, and his water bottles were full. He had the means to make a fire. He had the means to stay hydrated. And yet, he had simply laid down and allowed the mountain to take him. The coroner could not determine a cause of death, because the elements had been too thorough in their work. But the most chilling detail was the clothes. Aaron was found wearing items that did not belong to him, and some of his own gear was missing entirely. We look for patterns because the alternative is too terrifying to contemplate. We want to believe in the serial killer or the mountain lion or the sudden onset of a fugue state, because those are things we can understand. We can build a cage for a killer. We can hunt a predator. We can medicate a mind. But how do you fight a geographic anomaly? How do you defend yourself against a patch of woods that decides you no longer belong in this version of reality? The case of Aaron Hedges is a textbook example of the harvest. A systematic removal of a human being from the map. The mountain didn't just kill him. It digested him. It took his time, his identity, and his physical form, leaving behind only a collection of riddles that mock our desire for closure. The searchers went home. The files were moved to cold storage. And the Crazies went back to their silent vigil. The equipment was another point of contention that kept the investigators awake in their bunkhouses. Aaron was a seasoned hunter, a man who knew how to pack a kit. When his backpack was recovered, It was found neatly leaning against a fallen pine tree. Inside, his emergency rations were untouched. The high-calorie bars, the dried meats, the energy gels. They were all there. A man starving or freezing would have clawed through that nylon to get to the fuel his body needed. Instead, it was as if he had simply decided he no longer required the sustenance of this world. There was no evidence of animal predation on the pack. No tooth marks from bears or coyotes. It was pristine, protected by some invisible bubble that kept the scavengers at bay while the man himself was being dismantled by the elements and whatever else wanders those ridges at night. Consider the weather during those first 48 hours. The golden window when a life is usually saved. The sky was clear when Aaron went into the brush. A perfect Montana autumn day. But the moment the call went out that a man was missing, the atmosphere curdled. A localized storm slammed into the Crazies with a ferocity that seemed personal. It brought sub-zero temperatures and a blinding, whiteout snow that made the use of helicopters impossible. This is a recurring theme in these disappearances. The sudden, violent intervention of the weather. It is as if the mountain is drawing a curtain, shielding its work from the prying eyes of the search crews. When the storm cleared, the landscape was reset. The tracks were gone, and the world was silent once again. It is a tactical maneuver executed by the terrain itself. The rancher who found the remains mentioned something that stayed out of the official press releases. He said that when he approached the site, the birds were silent. Not just quiet, but absent. In a forest teeming with jays and nuthatches, there was a circular zone of absolute stillness around the bones of Aaron Hedges. He felt a profound sense of wrongness, a prickling on the back of his neck that told him he was trespassing in a place that was not meant for the living. He didn't use his radio right away. He just stood there for a long time, feeling the cold air move through the clearing. He said it felt like the mountain was exhaling, satisfied with its meal, and he was afraid that if he moved too quickly, the mountain might decide it was still hungry. There is a theory among some of the more fringe researchers that these areas, these high-altitude voids, are places where the veil between what we see and what actually exists is worn thin. They call them portal areas or window spots. They suggest that Aaron Hedges didn't get lost in the traditional sense. He simply stepped through a perforated edge in the fabric of the woods. This would explain why he was found in a place that had been searched multiple times. This would explain why his gear was found in locations that required him to be in two places at once. We scoff at these ideas because they undermine our sense of security. We want to believe the world is a solid, predictable machine. But the more you look into the missing 411 phenomena, the more you realize that the machine is broken, and the gears are made of something we don't understand. The boots remain the most haunting image for me. Imagine the sensation of cold mud and sharp granite against your bare feet, or feet covered only by thin wool socks. Imagine the desperation that would drive a man to discard his only protection against the elements. Some call it paradoxical undressing, a symptom of late-stage hypothermia where the victim feels a burning heat and strips off their clothes. But Aaron didn't just strip. He placed his boots miles apart. He traveled over terrain that would shred a human foot to the bone. Yet his socks were found relatively intact. It defies the laws of friction in biology. It suggests that for a period of time, Aaron Hedges was no longer subject to the physical constraints of our world. He was being moved, or he was moving in a way that we cannot calculate. The search for answers in the Crazy Mountains is a journey into a hole of mirrors. Every piece of evidence leads to a question that contradicts the previous one. The family is left with a box of bones and a collection of stories that don't add up. They are told it was a tragic accident, a hunter who got turned around and succumbed to the cold. But they know the man Aaron was. They know he wasn't a novice. They know he loved those mountains. And they know that the mountains didn't love him back. The silence from the authorities is the loudest part of the story. They don't want to talk about the anomalies. They don't want to talk about the dozens of other hunters who have vanished in similar circumstances across the western United States. They want you to stay on the trail, pay your park fees, and ignore the feeling of eyes on your back. The mountain has a memory, and it is long. It remembers the people who lived here before the maps were drawn. The people who knew better than to climb certain peaks after the sun went down. They had names for the things that lived in the high timber. Names that we have forgotten in our rush to colonize the wilderness. We think we are the masters of the earth because we have satellite imagery and cell phone towers. But Aaron Hedges found out the hard way that our technology is a thin veneer. When you are alone in the deep woods, and the fog rolls in, and your compass starts to spin, you are back in the Stone Age. You are just another warm-blooded creature trying to survive in a cold, indifferent landscape. And sometimes, the landscape decides it wants your warmth for itself. I think about the last moments of Aaron Hedges often. I wonder if he knew what was happening to him. I wonder if he saw the things that were moving in the shadows. Or if he was already gone before his body finally stopped. Did he feel the mountain opening up for him? Did he hear the whispers in the wind that told him to take off his boots and walk into the dark? We will never know. The dead don't talk. And the mountains don't give up their secrets easily. They just sit there, ancient and jagged, watching us with a cold, stony indifference. They are playing a game that has been going on for millions of years. And we are just the latest pieces on the board. If you ever find yourself in the Crazy Mountains, near the area where Aaron disappeared, take a moment to stop and listen. Don't listen to the birds or the wind in the trees. Listen to the silence underneath it all. There is a hum there. A vibration that tells you that you are being watched. Don't wander off the trail. Even for a second. Don't trust your GPS. And don't trust your eyes. The light in the high country is a liar. It can make a cliff look like a meadow and a shadow look like a man. Keep your gear tight. And keep your mind sharper. Because the moment you let your guard down, the moment you think you understand the wilderness, is the moment the wilderness decides to keep you. The phenomenon is not limited to Montana. It is a global shadow that follows the mountain ranges of the world. From the Pyrenees to the Andes, the story is the same. People vanish in the blink of an eye. The weather turns. The dogs fail. The bodies are found in impossible places. It is a signature. A mark of something that operates outside our understanding of predatory behavior. It is not about hunger in the biological sense. It is about something else. A harvest of souls. A collection of biological specimens. Or perhaps just a cruel game played by entities that find our struggle for survival amusing. We are the ants on the picnic blanket. And the mountain is the hand that comes down from above. The case of Aaron Hedges is just one chapter in a book that is being written every year. We see the same details in the disappearance of Bart Schleyer in the Yukon. A world-class hunter and woodsman who vanished and was found as a pile of bones and scattered gear with no clear cause of death. We see it in the case of Joe Keller, a 19-year-old who vanished while on a run in Colorado and was found a year later in a boulder field that had been searched dozens of times. The patterns are undeniable. The anomalies are consistent. And the silence from the people in charge is deafening. They know, or at least they suspect, that there is something in the woods that we cannot control. We are left with the bones and the boots and the empty backpacks. We are left with the grieving families and the searchers who can't sleep at night. And we are left with the mountains. They aren't going anywhere. They will be here long after our cities have crumbled into dust. They will still be jagged. They will still be cold. And they will still be waiting. Every time a hiker zips up their jacket and steps onto the trail, every time a hunter loads his rifle and heads into the timber, the mountain watches. It counts the heartbeats. It measures the distance. And it waits for the perfect moment to reach out and take what it wants. This is the reality of the missing 411. It is not a collection of campfire stories. It is a record of a predator that we cannot see. It is a map of the places where the world is thin. Aaron Hedges was a man of the woods. A man who thought he knew the rules. But the rules changed on him somewhere on that ridge in the Crazies. He stepped into a world where the laws of physics are suggestions and the mountain is the judge, jury, and executioner. His story is a warning to all of us who seek solace in the wild. The wilderness is beautiful. Yes, but beauty is often a mask for something much darker. As we close the file on Aaron Hedges, we must look at the others. The ones who are still out there. The ones whose boots have not been found. The ones whose families are still waiting for a phone call that will never come. They are part of the pattern too. Like the disappearance of Danny Philippidis. A firefighter who vanished from a ski resort in New York and turned up 6 days later in California. Dazed and confused, with no memory of how he traveled 3,000 miles. Or the case of Stephen Kubacki, who vanished in the snow of Lake Michigan and reappeared 15 months later in a field in Massachusetts. These are the glitches. These are the ones who came back. But they are never the same. They carry the silence of the void with them for the rest of their lives. The mountain is always hungry, and it has all the time in the world. It doesn't care about your plans or your family or your future. It only cares about the harvest. So the next time you go into the high places, pay attention to the silence. Pay attention to the way the shadows move when you aren't looking. And if you feel that prickle on the back of your neck, if you hear your name whispered in the wind, don't stop. Don't look back. Just keep walking until you see the lights of the city. Because once the mountain decides it wants you, there is no place on earth where you can hide. The mystery of Aaron Hedges remains a dark stain on the history of the crazy mountains. It serves as a grim reminder that for all our progress, we are still vulnerable to the ancient forces of the earth. We are still the prey, and the hunter is something we cannot even begin to describe. Similar to the vanishing of 19-year-old Joe Keller in the mountains of Colorado, or the strange case of 6-year-old Dennis Martin in the Great Smoky Mountains. These incidents suggest a terrifying consistency in the way people are taken. They vanish in seconds, often in the presence of others, and they are never seen the same way again. The void is real, and it is closer than you think.